Chuck Taylor, sweetie. Baby, you'll better sit down for this one, because the whole internet is about to catch fire tonight. And let me explain what really happened. After weeks of everybody in the culture pretending to move on from that not like us aftermath, the game just walked to the front of the room and told the world he thought Kendrick Lamar was dissing him on that record. Yes, the game. That game. The Compton legend himself. And yes, that man actually said it out loud in front of witnesses, in front of a running camera, in front of a rap podcast that already had the receipts loaded and ready to fire. And gang, the second I heard it, I had to rewind the tape twice because I could not believe what the game was really claiming. So let me walk y'all through everything, because trust me, this one is layered, this one is petty, and this one has industry fingerprints all over it. Now first, a little bit of background before we get into the good stuff. The game and Kendrick Lamar have shared a city, a coast, a set of streets, and a mutual respect for years. Compton raised them both. Dr. Dre stamped them both. And for the longest time, nobody in the culture ever dared to imagine the game and Kendrick Lamar in the same rap sentence as rivals, because the game was one of the loudest voices publicly hyping Kendrick when Kendrick was still climbing. So the idea that the game now believes Kendrick Lamar took a subliminal swing at him inside Not Like Us, the biggest cultural nuclear strike of the last 2 years, is honestly one of the wildest turns this whole saga has produced. And sugar, this is about to spiral, I'm telling you. This is the kind of story that will not stay buried, no matter how many publicists try to bury it. Alright, quick backstory before we keep going. Not Like Us, as everybody who has been within radio distance of a phone already knows, was Kendrick Lamar's decisive blow in his war against Drake. That song was surgical. Every bar had a bullseye, and every bullseye had Drake's name spelled across it. It was not a scattergun. It was not a group letter. It was a heat-seeking missile fired at one man and one man only. So when the news dropped, courtesy of Stat Quo speaking on the Third Verse podcast alongside Justin Hunt, that the game had genuinely believed Kendrick Lamar was speaking on him inside that record, the internet let out a collective what in the world. Gang, I had to pause my coffee. I had to close my laptop. I had to open it back up just to make sure I heard it right. According to Stat Quo, who by the way is one of the most respected inside voices in West Coast rap history, and someone who has known the game for the better part of 2 decades, the game called him personally, panicked, convinced Kendrick Lamar had aimed a bar in his direction. Stat Quo said he sat on the phone with the game for over an hour, walking the game off the ledge, telling him plainly, calmly, and with receipts that Kendrick Lamar was not thinking about him. Not once. Not in the intro, not in the outro, not in a single syllable. Stat Quo said he even told Top Dog the same thing later, because he wanted the record set straight before it turned into a bigger mess. And gang, that is where the entire story flips into something you cannot unsee. The trigger, apparently, was one line. Just one. Kendrick Lamar opens Not Like Us with the phrase "I see dead people," and the game apparently heard that intro and immediately, instinctively, and dramatically assumed the line was pointed at him. Why? Because the game once used that exact same phrase on a record of his own years ago. A Dr. Dre-produced record. The game said the same sentence at the top of his own song, and in his mind, that was too specific to be coincidence. So he decided the shot was for him. Case closed, in his own head at least. No trial. No jury. No cross-examination. Just paranoia dressed up as evidence. And yes, that man actually spiraled about it for weeks before Stat Quo finally got through to him. Baby, I have questions. I have follow-up questions. I have questions for the follow-up questions. Because let's be real with each other for a second. The game is a legend. There is no debate about his pen. He is one of the technically sharpest MCs the West Coast has ever produced, and even his loudest critics know he can rap the paint off the walls. But this pattern of the game hearing songs and instantly assuming his name is the invisible target inside them. That pattern is not new. Stat Quo actually revealed that when Kendrick Lamar released The Heart Part 4 years ago, and the culture was busy debating whether Kendrick was aiming at Big Sean, the game called Stat Quo again with the same panic. Convinced Kendrick was speaking on him. Convinced the bars had his fingerprints on them. Stat Quo said he had to reach out to Kendrick Lamar directly that time, and Kendrick told him, and I quote, "I would never diss the game. What is he even talking about? Sugar, that is not a coincidence anymore. That is a receipt. That is a pattern with a passport. So what exactly is going on inside the game's head? Why does the game keep hearing his own name written into songs where his name never appears? That is the real question the culture is asking. And honey, the theories are flying faster than the album drops. Some fans are calling it main character syndrome. Others are calling it a guilty conscience. And a growing chorus is calling it something far messier. Jealousy dressed up as suspicion. Now let me be transparent with y'all. I am not out here trying to slander the game. That man has classic albums stacked to the ceiling. The documentary alone put him in the Hall of Fame conversation, and every West Coast fan under 40 grew up rapping his verses. But the timing of this Not Like Us confession is exactly what has the culture side-eyeing him. And let me explain why. The game is about to enter a Verzuz battle against YG. That match has been circled on the calendar for weeks, and the entire hip-hop internet has been debating who wins that catalog fight. And right when the promo cycle needs oxygen, right when the game needs eyes and clicks and headlines, this Kendrick Lamar story suddenly surfaces. Everybody look at me. Insiders are already whispering that the timing is way too clean to be an accident. Way too polished. Way too press-ready. Alright, let me pause here for the poll, because y'all know I need your verdicts in the comments. Do you have the game winning that Verzuz, or do you have YG winning it? Personally, I lean YG, and I will tell you exactly why in a second. But first, let's finish this Kendrick chapter, because it gets crazier. And by crazier, I mean chaotic industry lawsuit level crazier. Because here is the moment that separates the game situation from any regular rap paranoia. Stat Quo told a story about a physical, in-person confrontation between him and the game at a Will.i.am event. Not a phone call, not a DM. A face-to-face argument inside a bathroom while a public conference was happening on the other side of the wall. Stat Quo said the game turned to him and said, and I paraphrase, "You are the reason I dissed Rick Ross." And Stat Quo shot back with the coldest response in the room. He said, "You were not supposed to diss anybody." He warned him not to say a single word about Kendrick Lamar. He told him the game was making enemies out of shadows. And baby, that image, two grown men from the culture yelling in a Will.i.am bathroom while executives sipped champagne 20 feet away, had me on the floor, gang. That is a scene from a movie. That is a Netflix docuseries opening in one paragraph. Anywho, the deeper you scratch this story, the more the pattern becomes obvious. The game keeps positioning himself dangerously close to Drake. The game and Drake filmed the 100 music video together in Compton on June 16th, a date that later became 616 in LA, which is basically the entire city's unofficial anthem day. The game brought Drake into Compton. The game defended Drake during the Kendrick War on multiple platforms. The game posted Drake favoring content on his stories while the culture was choosing sides. The game essentially planted his flag next to Drake at the exact moment Kendrick Lamar was being crowned by the entire West Coast. And gang, that is not a small detail. That is the whole map. So let me ask y'all a real question. If you were Kendrick Lamar, standing at the pop-out, sharing the stage with Dr. Dre, watching the entire city fall in behind you, and a fellow Compton rapper who is publicly hanging out with your biggest opponent decides to sit that historic moment out, what would you think? Because that is the exact fork in the road that put the game on the outside of the biggest West Coast celebration of the last 2 decades. And that outside position, that quiet exclusion, might be exactly why the game keeps hearing shots in songs where no shots exist. Not because Kendrick Lamar is aiming at him, but because the game already knows where he stands, and his ears are filling in what his eyes have already seen. And sugar, this is where the second layer of the story kicks in. Because the game has never been shy about crowning himself. When he released his list of the top MCs from Los Angeles, the game placed the game at the top. Not Kendrick Lamar. Not Snoop. Not Dr. Dre in his prime. The game. And listen, every rapper is supposed to believe he is the best. Confidence is part of the sport. Nobody wants a humble rapper. Nobody wants an MC who steps to the mic and shrugs. But when the whole culture is bowing to Kendrick Lamar in real time, and the man who put himself at the top of the list is not the man the culture is celebrating, that gap, that awkward silence between self-perception and public reality, is where paranoia gets born. And once paranoia is born, every line in every song starts sounding like a shot. Every ad-lib sounds like an accusation. Every producer tag sounds like a warning. Now let me be fair to the game for a full minute, because balance matters. Kendrick Lamar has never publicly disrespected the game. Kendrick Lamar has praised the game on record. Kendrick Lamar has repeatedly acknowledged Compton's older lineage. So this is not a story about a Kendrick game feud, because there is no feud. There is only the game hearing echoes that Kendrick Lamar never sent. That distinction matters, because it changes the entire moral shape of the situation. This is not two rappers at war. This is one rapper haunted by a war that was never declared on him. That is a heavy sentence, but sugar, it is the accurate sentence. Alright, back to the Verzuz, because y'all asked. Here is my honest read. The game is technically the sharper pen. If you put both discographies on a lyrical scoreboard, bar for bar, syllable for syllable, technique for technique, the game edges YG. There is no shame in saying that. YG himself would probably nod at that. But Verzuz is not a bar contest. Verzuz is a crowd contest. Verzuz is about which song makes the entire room jump when the beat drops. And YG has a run of records that make rooms move in ways the game simply does not match head-to-head. My Crazy Life is an event. Still Brazy is an event. The anthems land like heavyweight punches. So while the game wins the technical column, YG likely wins the arena column. And in Verzuz, the arena column is the only column that counts. Ask anybody who has ever attended a live one. The crowd is the judge. Which brings us back around to the biggest question of the whole night. Why is the game putting the Kendrick Lamar name back in play right before that Verzuz? Why now? Why this story, this week, this month? Insiders inside the West Coast circuit are already pointing at what looks like a strategic press play. Attach yourself to the biggest name in the culture, generate the biggest possible headline, and drag the algorithm into your promo cycle whether the algorithm wants to come or not. And gang, that is a losing hand no matter how it flips, because Kendrick Lamar is not going to respond. YG is going to show up with anthems anyway, and the game just handed the internet a story that makes him look smaller instead of bigger. That is not a promo campaign. That is a public relations landmine wearing a promo campaign costume. Let me pause again for the second poll, because I want your verdicts. Do you believe the game genuinely thought Kendrick Lamar was dissing him on Not Like Us? Or do you believe the game is manufacturing headlines to boost his Verzuz clicks? Because those are two very different accusations, and both of them carry weight. Drop your verdict for me in the comments underneath, and I promise I read every single one. I answer as many as I can. Y'all already know how this channel operates. Now here is where the story takes its darkest turn, and honey, brace yourselves. Because the ripple effect from this confession is already spreading. Since Stat Quo went public with the story, 3 separate industry voices have started whispering about other times the game reportedly reached out to mutual contacts, worried a Kendrick Lamar bar was aimed at him. 3 separate times. Different songs. Different eras. Different producers in the room when the tracks were built. And every time, the answer came back the same. Nobody was talking about you, dog. Nobody was thinking about you. Nobody was writing about you. And every time, the game apparently could not accept the answer. Sugar, that is not a rap problem. That is a mirror problem. That is a therapy problem in a Louis Vuitton jacket. And the culture is noticing. Fellow West Coast artists have been quietly signaling their concern. Podcasters who normally defend the game are now hedging their language. The DJ Vlad interview circuit is already lining up their questions, and you already know what the first question is going to be. Do you still stand by what Stat Quo said? Do you still think Kendrick Lamar was aiming at you? And whatever answer the game gives on that couch will define the next chapter of his career, because there is no version of that answer that fixes this. If he doubles down, he looks paranoid. If he backs off, he looks caught. That is the kind of trap only a rapper walks himself into. And nobody hands him a map on the way out. Meanwhile, Kendrick Lamar is doing what Kendrick Lamar always does. Nothing. Not a tweet. Not a story. Not a subliminal. Not a stage moment. The man walked away from the biggest rap war of the decade and has said practically 0 words since. And that silence, that surgical Kendrick silence, is doing more damage to the game right now than any diss track ever could. Because when your opponent will not even acknowledge that you exist, the entire culture reads that silence as a verdict. And that verdict is public, permanent, and printed in bold. Sugar, that is the coldest verdict in the game. Alright, let me build the bigger picture, because I want y'all to see the full board. This is not just a story about one paranoid intro line. This is a story about what happens when a legend feels the culture moving on without him. The game was the future once. There was a stretch in the mid-2000s when the game was the West Coast. The documentary was a movement. Doctor's Advocate was a masterpiece. LAX was a moment. And then, slowly, the culture shifted, and Kendrick Lamar rose, and Nipsey rose, and YG rose, and a new generation started planting flags on soil the game used to own. That kind of shift is emotionally violent for any artist, no matter how confident he is on the mic. And when the shift finally lands, some artists retreat gracefully into legacy, and some artists start hearing shots in songs that were never aimed at them. The game, according to Stat Quo, is currently living in the second category. And that category is a lonely address. And baby, that is a heartbreak the microphone cannot solve. Which brings us to Drake, because you cannot tell this story without saying Drake's name out loud. The game and Drake are close. Publicly close. Musically close. Personally close. They filmed the 100 video together in Compton. They have collaborated. They have vouched for each other. And when the Kendrick Lamar war exploded, the game did not move to neutral ground. The game stayed camped inside Drake's corner, which, culturally, put the game on the wrong side of the West Coast's biggest moment. Now, hindsight is unfair, and nobody is required to switch alliances just because the wind changes. But when your entire home city crowns another man, and you spent the year standing next to that man's opponent, the isolation that follows is not a rumor. It is math. Cold, calculator flat math. And that isolation, I believe, is the real ghost inside the Not Like Us confession. The game did not hear Kendrick Lamar say dead people and think about a specific line. The game heard Kendrick Lamar and thought about his own reflection. Because when you are the Compton legend who did not get invited to the pop out, every Kendrick Lamar song is going to sound like it might be about you. Even when it isn't. Especially when it isn't. That is not paranoia. That is proximity guilt. Anywho, let me hit y'all with the last big turn, because there is one more receipt on the table. Reports out of the West Coast are saying that Dr. Dre himself was the one who uttered the line, "I see dead people at the pop out." Dr. Dre, not Kendrick Lamar, not a subliminal writer in a booth. Dr. Dre, at the biggest hometown moment of Kendrick's career, said the line out loud on stage. So when the game hears Kendrick Lamar say the same line inside Not Like Us, and then hears Dr. Dre say the same line inside the pop-out celebration, the paranoia becomes a hall of mirrors. Because the game once said that line on a Dr. Dre-produced record. So the game is now walking around convinced that his own catalog is being weaponized against him by the people who helped him build it. Sugar, that is a psychological loop only therapy can untangle. And even therapy might charge extra for this one. Let me also drop this in for the fans who have been paying attention. There have been reports that at a recent birthday celebration, the game grabbed a live microphone and said something that industry watchers described as, and I am quoting the phrasing that has been circulating, a little bit crazy. If you have not heard the clip, look it up, because what the game said on that mic, in front of that crowd, was aimed at the West Coast throne. That was not a coincidence either. That was a man staking a claim in a room where the claim had already been settled somewhere else. And when that clip surfaces again, and it will surface again, it is going to be replayed side by side with this Not Like Us confession, and the picture is going to look even worse than it already does. And that, gang, is the real story behind the story. Not Kendrick Lamar dissing anybody. Not Stat Quo cooking anybody. Not the podcast circuit exaggerating anything. This is the story of a legend who cannot tell the difference between coincidence and combat, and who is about to walk into a Verzuz against a hungry YG carrying a decade of quiet resentment and a head full of imagined enemies. It is a losing hand no matter how it flips, and every card he plays from here will only prove it faster. One more layer before I let y'all go, because I know y'all like the deep dives. There is a growing conversation on West Coast rap podcasts about how the game's public relationships with East Coast artists over the years, from 50 Cent to Rick Ross to Drake, have quietly cost him political capital in his own city. Every time he leaned into an outside coalition, a piece of local trust shifted. And when Kendrick Lamar finally became the face of the culture, that accumulated distance became impossible to close. So this Not Like Us moment, this random-sounding confession about a phrase on an intro, is really the tip of a much larger iceberg that has been forming under the game's feet for 2 decades. The song did not create the paranoia. The paranoia created the song. So let me leave y'all with the last big question, and I want every single one of you to answer it under this video. Do you believe the game is being honest about hearing shots inside not like us? Or do you believe the game is using Kendrick Lamar's name as free promo for a Verzuz he needs to survive? Drop your verdict for me in the comments underneath. And while you are down there, tell me who wins that Verzuz between the game and YG. Because y'all already know that story is coming next, and I am going to break every second of it down for you on this channel first. Before Vlad, before academics, before anybody, y'all already know. I love y'all. I appreciate y'all. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already, because the next chapter of this story is going to be even louder. And I will see you inside the next one, gang.